Asia Tech Podcast with Graham Brown and Michael Waits.
Hello and welcome to Asia Tech Podcast Stories. My name is Graham Brown, and one thing we love more than anything else here on ATP Stories is understanding the journey of a startup founder, especially when it comes to a journey that cuts across geographical borders. You know, launching a tech startup is hard enough on its own, but doing that in another country, a country you didn't necessarily grow up in, well, that's a double challenge. So here to help us understand the why of all of that is David Henderson, CEO and founder of Driver. Now, just a bit of background. Driver is, well, I'm sure he's going to give a better heads up on this, but I would describe it as a telematics software company used for optimizing auto fleets. And David will give us a better description, obviously, in a minute. And what makes this so fascinating is that he moved from Australia to Thailand to set this up. But it doesn't stop there. He's not from Australia originally, but from the Seychelles, of all places. So before we dive in, David Henderson, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Graham. Hi, everyone.
It's fantastic that you're here. I mean, already there's questions that we have to ask, moving from the Seychelles to Australia to Thailand. I'm sure there may be some other detours en route. So tell us a little bit about, first, where did you actually grow up? Did you grow up in the Seychelles or in Australia?
I grew up in both. So I was born in the very beautiful East African tropical islands of the Seychelles. I kind of left there with my parents in the kind of early 1980s, kind of political refugees, if you like, or basically driven out by the kind of government nationalizing my father's business. We then moved to the UK, and we're there for about another 4 or 5 years, and then moved out to Australia after that.
Right. Where were you based in Australia? Where did you live?
In the lovely city of Melbourne.
Right, okay. That's interesting because, these days Melbourne comes up quite a lot when you talk about the startup scene in Australia, right? It seems to be booming, especially in the online space, right? So it seems to have its own startup scene. So it's interesting that you chose to move from Melbourne to Thailand. It's not an obvious transition, so maybe it is to you, but for those listeners who don't understand why an educated, ambitious entrepreneur would move from Melbourne to Thailand, tell us a little bit about the why behind that move for you.
Well, it's a question that I often get asked, and it's a very valid question. So yes, definitely Melbourne has a booming sort of startup scene, and it's competing with a kind of another city slightly to the north for the crown.
Do they get a mention or not?
Yeah, starts with an S and ends with, is it a Y?
Imagine.
Not sure. Anyway, yeah. So look. In our case, I'm one of the founders of Driver, so there was myself and my other two co-founders, Eugene and Damien. We decided to locate the business in Southeast Asia for a number of reasons. Basically, there's a very large automotive presence here in Southeast Asia, and I don't know if you know anything about Australia, but the automotive sector is very much in decline. And there were 3 manufacturers of vehicles in Australia. Now there are none. So that is a sector very much in decline in Australia, and it is still a growing sector in both Indonesia and Thailand and some of the other ASEAN countries. So that was one of the key reasons why we selected Thailand as our base. That's very specific to us, but there are other reasons why Thailand was chosen ahead of, say, Jakarta, which is also a valid choice for that sort of automotive space. Thailand's, in terms of bootstrapping a startup, it is much more affordable and cheaper to be based here in Thailand than, say, in Singapore. So Singapore, we were offered a accelerator program and some funding to move to Singapore, but we did the maths and we worked out that we'd probably spend all of that money in 3 to 4 months, and the same money would keep us going for 12 months in Thailand. Thailand's a very attractive place for foreigners to come and live in Thailand. There's also quite a good tech scene here in Thailand. So there are many reasons why we chose to locate here in Thailand. And our product is not aimed at the kind of domestic Thai market solely, but at the broader sort of ASEAN, Southeast Asian market.
So did you start the business before you moved to Thailand, or did it happen afterwards?
No, we started the business before we moved to Thailand.
In Melbourne.
In Melbourne, correct. And we decided to execute a pivot. So originally our business was aimed at essentially around driver behavior monitoring for insurance companies. Now, there's only a small number of insurance companies in Australia, and it's basically dominated by two main players, the insurance sector. So we found it quite difficult to get traction and also to get people to take our product in terms of our customers. That's the insurance companies. So we felt that there was a good opportunity here in Southeast Asia with applying the same technology but to a different industry segment, which was actually fleet management and the logistics sector. So that's what we did.
Just before we'll go a bit more into detail in your business model in a minute, I'm just curious. There were three founders, you say. There are
Correct.
Three founders. Did any of you have experience in Thailand business-wise before you decided to take the leap of faith to set up there?
So Damien, our CFO, was working with the British High Commission in Singapore, and he had experience in both Thailand, actually in all ASEAN countries. So,
right.
So he was actually helping with the operational setup of the British High Commission's setup here in Thailand and also in Myanmar, where we were very active, and other countries.
Right. So where did that conversation come? Who actually pitched the idea? Right, we're in Melbourne now. We're out there pitching to, probably a small group of insurance companies, as you say. Maybe things will be easier in Thailand. Who actually came up with that idea? Was that just sort of one of those aha moments where you're sitting around? Or I'm just curious to know how that actually happened.
Well, it was I'd love to say this was a deeply thought out strategy that we executed to like clockwork, like the German general staff or something like that. But in the real world, things don't happen that way. It was a combination of both strategy but also opportunistic events occurring. So I was on holiday out here in Thailand. My brother, who I should mention as well, lives here in Bangkok and has lived here for many years. So it wasn't as if we were just completely turning up with knowing no one and in a totally strange city. Right. So we did have that sort of. He then introduced us to some local contacts. We discussed that. We sat down and discussed what the needs were with some of their contacts, and then we identified that there was a gap in the market. So I've been doing similar sort of things in the telematics space for the last 5 to 6 years now with another company in Australia. So I decided to do my own thing, and we thought that Southeast Asia was the growth market for this sort of technology. Right.
So when that idea was pitched internally, when you three founders had that discussion, was it something which was an easy option for you? I mean, I know you've lived in a number of different countries, so it's not like a completely new scenario for you. But you are moving from Australia to Thailand. I know you had your brother there as well. I'm just curious to know, was it very easy for you to make that decision, or did you have to, go and do all the background research? Because this is something that faces a lot of entrepreneurs, especially when thinking about Asia. Often when they get there, they realize actually a lot of what they were worried about, well, that sort of evaporates, and they realize it's just as developed as a lot of countries they've been used to. I'm just curious to know what your thought processes were before you moved out there.
Yeah, I mean, look, this definitely wasn't a kind of spur of the moment sort of let's pack our bags, and except for maybe Eugene, our technical co-founder, but myself and Damien did put a lot of thought into this, and there was we did research on this, on what. And we spoke to the Thailand Board of Investment. We met with them several times. And, unfortunately, that BOI organization, which is quite useful and handy when you're in Australia, is not as useful in Thailand itself. So things were much more difficult than we had anticipated when we landed. But anyway.
That's all part of the journey, right? You live and learn. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's talk a bit about what exactly Driver is. I mean, you mentioned telematics. I mean, you've been in the telematics industry for a number of years. I mean, I come from a telecoms background, so I've heard telematics from, 15, 20 years back. It's been a word that's been around. But for those people who are listening who might not know exactly what it is or have heard it and need a better definition, can you kind of help us understand what exactly we're talking about here?
For sure. I mean, this is, again, one of these kind of nebulous terms like IoT or, big data, which is sort of thrown around. It's a little bit less popular than it used to be, and it's not one of the latest buzzwords. But essentially, it's about collecting data from vehicles, and mostly around data for driver behavior and to improve the cost of operating a fleet of vehicles. So the traditional telematics solutions were developed back in the 1990s, and this is about pushing a button in your, Cadillac or Chevrolet and having Batman turn up when you had an accident. Mm-hmm. So, that was the original OnStar sort of first application of telematics. It's just essentially a push button solution in the car that allowed you to connect the vehicle to the outside world. That's now moved on to things like harvesting data from the vehicle, like when the check engine light comes on, diagnostics data, driver behavior information, and one of the kind of leading telematics companies, if you like, is Tesla in the US. So a lot of what they're doing would not be possible without telematics and the connected car, which is what it's often referred to as now. So what Driver is doing, which is a little bit different, is that we've taken a lot of these concepts of collecting data from the vehicle and analyzing that data, and we've localized that for the Southeast Asian market. So what I mean by that is we've layered on top gamification so that when you play this data back to the people who are interested in it, the fleet managers, the drivers, these sort of people, you don't just send an Excel spreadsheet. We actually create a league table of who's the best driver, who's the most efficient driver. And one of the reasons we do that is we found that there's a big problem here with people stealing fuel. So that's something that we're not really that familiar with in Australia or perhaps Japan, but in Southeast Asia, it's a big issue, and it's roughly 25% of all fuel is pilfered.
Wow,
which
that's
is
a big number.
It's a huge amount of fuel. And what we found initially was that we can highlight that to the fleet operators, and we can even tell them who's stealing that fuel to some extent, but what I heard from one of the fleet managers was, well, if we sacked every driver who was stealing fuel, we wouldn't have any drivers left. So that carrot and stick approach, the stick sort of approach, doesn't really work. So that's why we layered on top of our system gamification to try and encourage the right behavior, and it works really well in the culture in Southeast Asia as well.
How would you do that? I mean, how would you actually gamify driver behavior such that they were incentivized not to steal fuel? Because stealing, fuel is obviously a valuable commodity for them compared to, I guess, some of the wages that some of these drivers are on. Yeah,
absolutely. And look, it's a real challenge. But what we try and do is there's two approaches we take. One of them is to work with the HR department of the company and encourage a program where people who are at the top of these league tables are financially rewarded for doing the right thing. Mm-hmm. That isn't something that's always welcome to, say, the elderly Chinese guy who's running the logistics operation we're working with. But the other thing that we do is we use peer group pressure. So nobody wants to there is actually this gamification works because people see other people doing well, or they actually want to get a picture of themselves with the company CEO or appear in the company newsletter. And it's not so much the financial reward, but the actual, the prestige and the fact that they look good in front of their colleagues.
Right, exactly. So is your solution at Driver a software solution, or do you have a box as well that sits inside the vehicle?
So we can do either the full end-to-end solution, which includes a box, but we don't provide, or we don't manufacture those boxes ourselves. That's a great way to go out of business, is to start a hardware startup. So,
there's plenty of people doing it as well, right?
So. Well, yeah, it's a tough game to be in, but that's not something that we're doing at the moment. We source different devices from reputable suppliers. Mm-hmm. Where what we do is we're a SaaS business. We charge a monthly subscription to our customers. They can cancel at any time with 90 days notice. And yet we haven't had any churn so far. So our customers are really happy with our service, and we get most of our business through referral and word of mouth.
Okay. So I know you came from a telematics background. Did you, when you were doing that, did you see something when you were working on the other side and said, yes, this is going to be a great business idea, I've got to go and start my own business? How did the genesis of Driver actually happen? I know you said there was a pivot as well, so maybe it's different to what it is today slightly. Can you tell us a little bit about how the thing actually started?
Yeah, so our chief architect, Eugene, and I were working together in telematics 3 years ago now. Well, would have been 4 years ago when this kind of concept originally started. So what we saw was that Telematics is a great company with lots of great people working there, but they're owned by one of the auto clubs. So what I mean by that is the guys who help you at the side of the road when you're broken down. So you ring them up. These are mostly companies that are 100 years old or 80 years old in the case of the RACV. They have their own agenda, and these organizations tend to be quite political. So they're not primarily focused on, say, a profit-focused business, or even have a kind of underlying purpose. They're there to serve the interests of their members, which is interpreted by elderly guys living in, the Yarra Valley outside of Melbourne. So they tend to be quite narrow focused. So we felt that there was a huge opportunity to apply this technology to Southeast Asia. We did some research. There weren't many people doing this in the Southeast Asian market. So we thought that we wanted to actually make a difference to the world, and we could do so by reducing the amount of fuel that's being used and making the roads safer. So in Thailand, for example, it's the world's second most dangerous roads. Yeah. Thousands of people die on the roads each year in Thailand. By applying our technology, we are in a small way helping to make the roads safer.
I mean, it's shocking, really, isn't it, when you look at the figures for Thailand compared to anywhere else in the world. Just how much of a factor that is, especially if you're young. If you're young and Thai, the mortality rates on the road are just, I don't have the figures in front of me, but I mean, compared to a developed economy, compared to Australia at least, probably 10 times or more per head. I don't know the exact figures, but I mean, I looked at them recently. Yeah,
it's shockingly high in Thailand. I mean, and what's even more amazing is the general attitude of people who've had a near miss. Right. Like you get maybe 2 or 3 people on the back of a motorcycle, and who were involved in a near death accident, and instead of being shocked or horrified by what's just happened, they'll just have a laugh, walk off.
It's quite fatalistic, isn't it? It's like, my number didn't come up. I'm lucky. I live to fight
lucky on. Day today. Yeah, let's have another whiskey.
Exactly. So I'm curious. I mean, in that context, I'm just going to sort of try and see it from the other side here. I mean, telematics is great when you have a population of people where you can make that kind of impact. I'm just curious to know, can that change when you have these kind of embedded cultural behaviors or norms, which, I don't know, you obviously know this market better than anybody else, but where you have those kind of behaviors, can telematics actually, crunching this data actually make an impact and change behavior on that side of things, where people are they can be quite reckless compared to what we're used to in other countries?
Well, that's an interesting question, because, I mean, I often see that, look, the Thai government believes so, that doesn't necessarily mean that I agree with the Thai government, but for example, one of the things I often see is a bus traveling at around 150 kilometers an hour with a sticker on the back saying GPS tracking by DTC or whoever it is, right?
Right.
So, look, the reality is that a lot of this stuff is not well implemented. It's not properly if it is implemented, then there's no policies or procedures around it. The data just gets sent to the Department of Land Transport and sits in a data center somewhere with nobody doing anything about it. Mm-hmm. So where we're different at Driver is that we understand the local culture, and we actually try and work with companies to make a difference. If there's somebody speeding recklessly or driving dangerously, then we would immediately send an alert to the owner of that company, to the manager of that company, and we can work with them to understand how, to show them how they can improve their business. So having your vehicle off the road for a day or 2 days because of an accident costs money. I mean, that means that you're no longer able to meet your customers' needs because you can't deliver your product to them anymore. So you as a business are losing money. On the individual driver's side, this gamification concept that we're in the process of implementing has made a big difference so far. So we think that there's definitely the potential for technology, but localized to the needs of Thailand and Myanmar and other countries to make a difference.
Okay, I want to ask you about Myanmar in a minute because, that's just a fascinating addition to your story as well. So we'll come to that in a minute. Just curious, to put this into context, switch gears a little bit, talk about the business itself. So how long has Driver been up and running?
So Driver's been up and running in its sort of current form for just under 2 years now.
Right. That's in Thailand, right? Based in Bangkok.
So our Driver has a parent company which is in Hong Kong. Like almost every startup in Thailand, we are either Hong Kong or Singaporean registered companies.
Okay, that's an administrative thing, but you are operationally based in Bangkok. So
yes.
You've been up and running 2 years. Are you self-funded? Do you have seed funding? How does that work with you?
So we have a great group of investors, some of which the very early sort of angel investors are, or the family and friends of mine, mostly in Australia, and then we have a group of angel investors in Hong Kong. I'm a regular visitor to Hong Kong. Those guys, Arnold and Lewis and Co., give us a lot of support and have also provided funding for us as well. So Driver is seeking investment at the moment. So we have, we are looking for around $300,000 to extend us to the next stage.
Okay. So just on that note, interesting to know, especially with the decisions that you've made with Driver. How much longer $300,000 will last you in Bangkok compared to, let's say, you had your operational base in Melbourne? Is it tangibly different? Give us an idea. As a comparison, how much longer will that money last you in a place like Bangkok than it would back home?
So in Australia, that would last us. So we have an existing team. Our team is currently 15. So if we had a team of 15 people in Melbourne, 300K would last us about a month and a half, 2 months. Yeah. In Thailand, that lasts us around 12 months.
It's amazing, isn't it? The difference there. Is there any difference? Are you sort of getting in local programmers, local software developers? Can you get that kind of talent in Thailand? Because people may argue, well, they cost more in Melbourne, but the quality's higher.
People do say that, but we have a mixed team of both Thais and foreigners. And I think you can get high-quality developers here in Thailand. Unfortunately, due to some decisions we've made about our technology stack, it's much harder for us than other sort of startups because we're using Scala amongst other things which are not easy to source here in Thailand.
Mm-hmm. But your point earlier about lasting 12 months as opposed to, even at most 2 months in Melbourne. So that's a factor of 6. That's phenomenal, isn't it? That just goes to show it's not just about money, but that's buying you time, isn't it? And these things take time. These things, sometimes they have their own cycle, which takes a bit of time, and you have to go out there and do the business development work and get the clients on board and so on. So it's just, fascinating to see that kind of, giving you that extra runway to build your business in Thailand. And if you were to shift that back to Melbourne, the money would be gone very, very quickly. So does that sort of give you a bit of breathing space to do the kind of things you wouldn't do if you were running a startup in Melbourne? Would you do things differently? Do you have the luxury to do things that maybe some of your founder friends back in Melbourne can't do because the burn rate is so fast?
Yeah, I would love to say yes, absolutely. That gives us a lot more luxury, but we have a different set of problems here to deal with from what we would be dealing with in Melbourne. So, like for example, in B2B sales, which is B2B where we're at the moment, there's a much longer lead time to get customers on board here. So it's very difficult to convince people to take an early stage product. So we actually have to build out the product to the concept of having an MVP and just showing people a wireframe and then them signing up to you is something that's not realistic and not going to happen to my experience in Southeast Asia. So we do need to build out the product, which means that you then have to take on a bit more risk. So you may end up building something which may not be suitable or might only be suitable for a smaller subset of customers. So there's pros and cons.
Okay. So the burn rate may be slower in Southeast Asia, but the actual sales cycle is longer. That's what you're saying, because they're less likely to jump at an early stage project compared to back in Melbourne, where they may be more used to people, knocking at their door and pitching more of what would be an MVP in traditional sense, right?
Absolutely, and people are much less forgiving of mistakes here, if you like. So there's a deeply ingrained culture, but both in Myanmar and Thailand and it's totally, it's not very productive. Is punishing people for making mistakes, or if something goes wrong, then you just cancel the project and that's the end of it type thing, which isn't very helpful and doesn't help people learn from experience.
Right. So I want to ask you about that Myanmar factor, because you have a presence now in Myanmar. Just tell us a little bit about that. Do you spend a lot of time out there? Because I haven't been to Myanmar. It's like the one country in Southeast Asia I haven't visited. So I'm curious to know what it's like to take driver to Myanmar, because Thailand's one thing. I mean, we talked about some of the challenges of being in Thailand, but I know Myanmar is like the place right now. Everybody seems to be talking about it as the next Thailand. We're looking at, you just look at the internet penetration rates. They are increasing by a factor of 0 every year, but it's going from like 1% to 10%. We're not sort of talking 70, 80, 90%, right? It's still early days. How has that been for you? So share some of your stories from doing business in Myanmar.
Well, Myanmar's an awesome place. I really like visiting Myanmar. I'm visiting Myanmar a lot less than I used to. When we first, in fact, Driver was launched first in Myanmar before Thailand. So there's a reason for that. So Myanmar is at an earlier stage of development than Thailand. So people are going there from pen and paper right into a 21st century mobile first approach. So it's actually one of the most awesome places to release a new product, because your competitor solutions are, something from 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. There isn't this hangover of legacy sort of processes and systems. So in Thailand, we have to deal a lot with legacy systems. Maybe from 10, 20 years ago, people use a lot of Oracle and these kind of outdated solutions. So, we don't have that in Thailand, in Myanmar. So, and also people are very, very interested in new technologies. And just to slightly correct what you were saying there about the penetration rate. So penetration rate now for mobiles is actually around 70%. Gotcha. So if you take a look at the Philippines, for example, the Philippines is, the economy is growing there, but the mobile phone coverage and mobile penetration is stagnated there. That there's a duopoly of these two telcos that really have done nothing for years, right? In Myanmar, MPT and Telenor have been growing in leaps and bounds. Even Ooredoo is growing.
So is it easier to do business in a place like Myanmar than it is in a more developed market like Bangkok or Thailand particularly, because you have this situation where people, they're leapfrogging many of these sort of legacy systems which have been around? I mean, they're sort of bypassing the fixed line internet and going straight to mobile, or they're going straight to these mobile application solutions which you're involved in. Do you find that the case?
Well, and again, it's not one of these clear-cut, absolutely, definitely Myanmar's a better option. If that was the case, then we would have our HQ in Myanmar and we'd be focusing our efforts there. So there are some very compelling reasons to be in Myanmar, but then there are also other less attractive things about the country. So people say that people complain about Thai bureaucracy and the government here, but compared to Myanmar, it's a breeze here in Thailand.
Exactly. So this is the growing pains associated with any kind of developing economy, isn't it?
Well, yes, and look, Myanmar is not ranked 182 in the world for the ease of doing business for no reason. Look, I mean, trying to set up a company there involves hiring a local agent who then goes around with a bag of cash to various police departments and government offices to get stamps, and it takes weeks. I mean, it's a very difficult and convoluted place, and the things like the tax regime aren't very friendly either to startups, and they've just changed the visa situation there. So now it's incredibly expensive to get a visa to stay in Myanmar and to work legally there. So it's a much less attractive place to be from a in terms of those sort of things. So the ease of doing business is very difficult in Myanmar, but the people are great. At some point they'll try and sort some of these these sort of issues out.
Yeah, for sure. Hey, I'm just curious, David, is that when you talk about Myanmar just now, and you talk about some of the challenges facing people like yourself, entrepreneurs who are trying to get things done, a lot of red tape, a lot of barriers associated to growing a company, etc. Obviously, the people are up for it, but maybe there's a system which has to be dealt with, and so on. I think people outside of Asia kind of have that image of Asia generally, that they feel it's this place that is, very heavy on bureaucracy, isn't as pro-business as maybe they would expect in Australia, especially, or the US, or in Europe, for example. When you have visitors come to Thailand, do you find that they're surprised by how it is there really? Are their expectations challenged by these assumptions that they have about Asia and doing business in Asia? And particularly for yourself as well, when you first, set up there, did you find that, maybe you had these kind of expectations of what Asia is like for doing business and found it to be different to that? Well,
I mean, look, to be honest, I was a little bit surprised about how inefficient things are. So, I mean, you walk into the business of the sort of Department of Business Development in Thailand, and there's a whole bunch of people sitting there with typewriters. So this is Digital Thailand 4.0.
Well, and we have that in Japan too, Dave.
Yeah?
Places, people
really?
with typewriters. We have people using faxes, so...
Wow, that's incredible. So I guess if you're from Japan, that's probably not too much of a surprise. But, people gripe a lot about the government wherever they are, whether it's the US or in Australia. But here it's, the part of the problem is it's quite intrusive, right? So the government just isn't there to really help businesses. It seems to be more of a hindrance. So there's all of these problems about getting visas for staff. There's lots of audits and paperwork and bureaucracy. So I have a staff member who's like pretty much full-time committed to, filling out forms for various Thai government agents.
Right.
It's a real
fixer. But
yeah,
it's
exactly.
like, if you were to do business in Spain, it would be pretty much the same.
True.
Exactly. You'd need a fixer who can kind of negotiate the unwritten parts of the system, the gaps, if you like.
Yes.
Just sort of moving forward from that, the people in general, beyond the infrastructure and the institutions, the Thai people, in terms of doing business, compared to, let's say, your experience in Australia, do you find a difference in attitude towards business there, particularly with the entrepreneurs that you associate with in Thailand? Do they have a different way of thinking about business, or is it something that maybe Australian entrepreneurs would be very familiar with?
Well, one of the things that's a bit, this is arguable again about how different it is, but to me, it's very much more face-to-face business here. Mm-hmm. Trust is much more of an important factor, and not necessarily price is the key factor in things. So, you need to meet with your customers. It might take, it's certainly in B2B space, it takes at least 2 to 3 meetings before you'll get any sort of any sort of agreement or moving forwards with anything. So, yeah, there's definitely differences. It's much harder to do things like e-commerce or to sell things online, especially the businesses. So, like we, for example, don't have a debit card for our business, even though we would like to get one. But it seems to be very difficult to get even that sort of thing. If anyone has a startup in banking, Thailand's a very difficult place to get going with that sort of thing, but it's somewhere which is crying out for a bit of someone to simplify those processes and make things a bit more innovative.
Right. That's probably where you'll see people leapfrog the traditional system, right? I mean, you're talking about that in Myanmar with leapfrogging fixed line internet. You're starting to see these kind of technologies now looking at these established infrastructures and just leapfrog, for example, what people know in the traditional banking system, and that may well happen in places like Asia. I'm curious as well. I mean, my experience of Asia in business, like yourself, has been, it's never been one or the other. It's been a mix of both the good and the challenges. The challenges being the things that you talked about. I'm always, I think, on balance, think of it as a positive thing. I found, one thing that always attracts me to doing business in Asia, outside of Japan particularly, is their natural entrepreneurialism. I've always found that there's a different kind of entrepreneurialism as well. I mean, I know, for example, in Thailand, you have a lot of the second generation people, that their parents have made money in retail, that kind of thing, or in auto, and now they're going to try something out online. But there's a real hustle that I find in Asia that you don't necessarily get so much in other countries, that people, I don't know if it's a need or a necessity, but people seem to hustle a lot more and seem to want to get things done. I don't know, what was your experience of that? Is that sort of just rose tinted glasses, or now that you're in the thick of it, is it actually like that for you?
No, I would agree. I mean, I think it's definitely that demographic of the kind of second or third generation people are exactly the kind of people who do have that hustle and want to get things done and want to change. But look, the other thing, and talking about it from a kind of Westerner point of view, coming into a country like Thailand, is as a foreigner, there are just so many more opportunities for you here in Thailand, and you can get. I've met with Bill Heineke, who's the owner of Minor Group, one of the richest men in Thailand. The chances of that happening in Australia are nil, right? So the opportunities here for foreigners who want to get things done, who are entrepreneurial, and even for second or third generation Thais, are much greater. So there's, in some ways, in certain areas, more social mobility than there are in other countries like Australia. So, I mean, a lot of the opportunities are already snapped up there, so there's not much you can really do. That said, in certain areas in Thailand, it's a closed shop and there's no chance for any foreigners. So, for example, financial services, agriculture, there are other sectors like that you just haven't got a hope in hell of getting anywhere.
Very interesting observation there. So, I mean, if I was a young, well, not necessarily young, but if I was a startup founder and I was considering moving to Thailand, maybe I'm based in Melbourne, I've listened to this story, I've listened to David Henderson's story, and it's planted a seed in my mind. What sort of advice would you offer that startup founder before they make the move? Is there conditions under which they probably shouldn't do it? Other conditions under which they probably should do it? How would you offer them any kind of advice in that situation?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that are very important. So you need to have a good support network of family and friends who support and believe in what you're doing. You also need to have some funding, so you can't just turn up in Thailand with some elephant print pants and a Buddha statue around your neck. It's you can get those here in Koh Phangan, but the idea of it that it's going to be sitting on the beach and doing a holiday here and being on holiday here in Thailand is the wrong sort of approach. I've met a lot of tech founders, both Thais and foreigners. With the foreigners, they tend to be two people. They're either building something for the Thai market, or else they're building something for their home market. So in the latter, and the vast majority of people are, like say a small startup of half a dozen Polish guys I met recently who were building something here in Thailand for Poland because they wanted to be in a warmer place over winter. It's $2 a day to be in a co-working space. They could just create a product here in Thailand in 6 months for $50,000. That's just not credible or realistic in many other places. So those kind of things are much easier than it is to say penetrate the Thai market or the sort of more Southeast Asian market. So if you're building an app in for Australia or wherever, then go to Chiang Mai or whatever, Koh Samui for 6 months. There's lots of nice co-working spaces. You can get stuff done pretty easily and quickly. But if you want to get into the Thai market, then it's absolutely critical that you have Thai staff. You cannot, come into Thailand and be successful in any way without having, a good understanding of the local culture. So you really need to have some Thai staff. It's very important to get those people as soon as possible and have good and reliable people. And I'm talking primarily on the business side. You will also ideally have some developers as well. But yeah, look, what I found a lot of Thai startup founders, they tend to be very young. So, in their early 20s. So people, when I go to pitch to some of the kind of funding events here, some of these elderly Thai guys, they say to me, why are you a startup founder? You're in your 40s. And I say, well, that's the best time to be a startup founder because you actually already know a bit about business and you're much less likely to fail than somebody who's just founded a business and they're straight out of university and has absolutely no experience.
So does that make it, because I'm curious what kind of person it takes to make this work, to move from another country to a place like Thailand. You mentioned you've got the experience and probably not just business experience, but life experience as well. You've got a lot more to play from, right? You've experienced a lot more. You know how to deal with these situations. You see a lot of people come to Thailand. Do you see any kind of pattern in the people that make success here? Do they have a certain kind of attitude? Have you found that with yourself that maybe you've had to sort of challenge your own views as well? And going to a place is always a challenge, isn't it? You step outside your comfort zone. You're always having to force yourself to, be a better person and learn and not sort of slip back into your old ways. So I'm just curious to know is that, coming to a place like Thailand, are there a certain type of people who are more likely to be successful in the entrepreneur scene there?
Well, I wish I could answer that question, but I can't really answer that question directly. But what I will say is that if you look at the stats for startups that have got funding, and I'm talking about like they've got to Series C in Thailand, for example, every single one of those startups, bar none, is founded by foreigners. So there is a good opportunity here but they just to clarify that they also have like some Thai founders or some very senior Thai staff in that organization. So you can't do it by yourself. You need to have you need to partner with Thais. And there are some great, some really good examples of some great startups here in Thailand that have been very successful. I mean, like Agoda, for example, is obviously one of the great sort of startups in the world, and they're from Thailand.
Yeah,
not
many people know that as well. That's the thing.
No,
right? I mean, outside of Thailand, people they might have thought it was an Australian company or based in Singapore, but there you go.
Absolutely, Angry Bird. The guys from Angry Birds, Roxio, whatever, they spend 3 to 4 months a year here in Thailand.
Yeah.
So that story can be, partially credited towards Thailand. But what I find is that you need patience here in Thailand. So if you take this kind of aggressive approach to doing business, then people don't. You need to keep a calm voice. You need to be nice to people. People here in Thailand are very nice. They're lovely people overall, and they don't really like being shouted at or being, people pointing at them saying, you do this right now. That doesn't work. It doesn't work anywhere, but it's much less likely to work here in Thailand. Be nice to people. Be patient. Things will come your way, but it'll take longer than you have ever planned for.
Well, that's great advice. As everything that you shared with us today, David. That's David Henderson, everybody, CEO of Driver. David, thanks so much for coming onto the show and sharing your journey with us and offering us words of wisdom, especially for those who may be considering doing the same. David, before I let you go, we want you to share a link where people can go and find out a bit more about you. Where can we find out more about David Henderson?
Probably best drvr.co.
That's the best starting point. We'll put all
the best starting point.
Details in the show notes. And we wish you all the best with your journey with Driver. Obviously, it's a very interesting one because you've chosen an unorthodox route in what you're doing. And I think it's fascinating, your journey, both as an individual entrepreneur, but also as a team making that happen. And now you're going for funding as well. Anybody that's listening to the show that may be interested in getting in touch, they can go to that website, which we'll put into the show notes, make contact with David. I'm sure David would be happy to talk to anybody on that in that respect. And David, please come back as well. I mean, we want to hear how this journey unfolds because I'm sure there's a lot more to it. You know, there's a lot more that we're going to learn in the next 6 months, 12 months. So please come back onto Asia Tech Podcast and share your updates with us. Thank you very much for joining us on the show today, David.
Thank you very much, Graham. Very much appreciate your time, and thank you to the listeners.
You've been listening to Asia Tech Podcast. Find out more at www.asiatechpodcast.com.